Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Francesca Bocca. You're most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much, Paul, for having me again.
It's great to have you back. And for those who don't recall, Francesca has a master's degree in neurocognitive psychology and a PhD in systematic neuroscience, both from the University of Munich in Germany. And she has also a diploma in Islamic psychology from the Cambridge Muslim College here in the UK. She has been working inside and outside academia on the issue of Muslim identity in Italy. Her latest book, titled The Italian Islam Manifesto, touches upon the most urgent topics facing Muslims in Italy. She's also the director of the Ibn Rushd Islamic Studies Institute, the first Italian language madrasa for children and youth. So it's fantastic to have you back. And what we're going to do is a three-parter, really, 3 videos, each looking at a similar area of study. The first one is, did Muslims invent psychology? Did Muslims invent psychology? And the second one we're going to call briefly a critique of Western psychology from an Islamic point of view. And the third one is healing, the topic of healing from an Islamic viewpoint. So this is looking at this subject from an Islamic perspective. So it's a hugely important topic, actually, much needed today to get to an Islamic understanding of psychology. So could you perhaps just briefly introduce this topic to us? Did Muslims actually invent psychology?
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much to all the listeners. I found this issue particularly important because we have this understanding that mental health is important nowadays. It seems to be really one of the things that we pay the most attention to in our everyday life. And when we look into the history of that, of how did it become so important, of course, psychology is one of the responsible factors for creating awareness. And when we look into psychology, even its Wikipedia page, I checked, but also textbooks, college textbook, university textbook, quote that this is a European invention, and this is a recent invention. Psychology is said to be a recent science, and we will discuss how much, I think, better in the next few points. But I think that this is something dangerous, because thinking that mental health, psychology is something that only has to do with postmodernity, perhaps, and the West is not the actual case. This is a part of a wider tendency to reset on previous knowledge, right?
So, right. I mean, I've heard that in books on the history of psychology, it's usually stated that psychology was born in 1879 in Germany. That's very recent, actually. So is that the case?
Yes, I think that if we stop and think for a second, that is really a crazy statement to believe. Can we really believe that human beings have not been thinking about the psyche or mental health before that? It is almost incredible. And however, the vast majority of textbooks would quote that and would say that the reason that psychology was invented in 1879 is because Wilhelm Wundt opened the first psychology lab. So it was the first time that psychology was treated as a hard science. So the lab is important for psychology because it is a symbol of psychology becoming free from the restraints of, for example, philosophy or theology or all the other sciences that contributed to its growth. And this is the main innovation to distinguish it from the ocean of psychological knowledge that we can gather already if we read classical Greek philosophy, for example. And psychology, getting closer to the hard sciences, is also a very important point for reductionism, right? Because we're saying that even human behavior actually is a thing. So we need a lab to study it. What we're saying, though, is not that we reject labs to be used in psychology, but mainly the lab is not the main tool we use to know the psychology. And psychology always has had a complex and still has a complex nowadays of a bit of a paradox of not believing that it's a scientific enough discipline. And you will see that already in university faculty. Sometimes it's being treated as humanistic subject, sometimes it's treated as a scientific one. You never quite know when you're doing psychology, whether you're a scientist or not. And psychologists suffer from that. And I see it as someone who has studied neuroscience, that in neuroscience environment, you very much feel like you're the superior brother of psychologists, right? Which makes no sense, because it is two different disciplines. So going back to 1879, there's another thing that I'd like to bring into consciousness here, that it is while the first psychology lab opens in Germany, 20 years later, the interpretation of dreams of Freud comes up. So this opens two pathways, one scientific and one non-scientific, and I'm not saying it with a judgment, it's just an observation, it's value-free, right? Ways to approach who we are, to approach the self. And these two diverse pathways, in a way, they still exist nowadays, and that's very interesting.
So what is the subject of psychology in an Islamic perspective? What's distinctive about that way of perceiving or understanding psychology?
Yes, when I tell people I do Islamic psychology among my interests, they almost always tell me, yeah, it's very good to take care of the mental health of Muslims.
Oh,
so they believe, they believe that basically Islamic psychology is making Western psychology halal or something like that. While this has nothing to do with Islamic psychology, even though it is something very noble and very useful for the community. But I think that what we're trying to do here is digging a little bit deeper. So we should first have clear that the subject of Western psychology now, so if we should say, what does Western psychology study to understand the discipline? It is, I think, human behavior. That's what they would say. And this, however, is epistemologically problematic, and it is even unauthentic when you compare it to the beginning of its discipline. Because psychology, when used to its linguistic reason, it means the study of the inside, of the psyche, of the soul, not of the behavior at all. So we first need to understand that psychology itself already perhaps lost a little bit its way.
Right.
And so in Islamic psychology, we always try to go a step back and to ask things whether they are authentic or we can bring them back to their own authenticity. We are revivers, right? That's a very beautiful thing of our civilization. But if we just look at it, if we are just from the Islamic side, so the subject of Islamic psychology is also called Ilmul Nafs. This has a very well-known name in Arabic to call this thing. So it existed before 1879 for sure, because people were giving it a name. And yeah, so the field there would be the equilibrium between all the parts of ourself, the body, the self, the heart, the soul, and the intellect. And I know these are many parts. We can discuss.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you. I just want to pause on that, because something that's very striking, if one is coming from the West and has a passing or a deeper knowledge of psychology, is you use the S word, the soul. And this is not some kind of poetic metaphor, is it, for some materialist thing in the mind that can be reducible to our chemicals, our neurology? No, you mean an actual metaphysical reality, a human soul that is not simply identical or reducible to the brain or something else in the body. Is that right? And this is very different from contemporary Western psychology, which does tend to be materialist and reductionist, as you've said, I think, in its way of understanding the human person. Although I guess I have to be, I mean, to be fair, people like Carl Jung, the 20th century psychologist, who was trained by or a colleague of Freud actually for a while, he might have acknowledged, I'm not sure, but he was much more open, I think, to that kind of way of seeing the human being as you put it, having many different facets or elements rather than just the physical in that reductionist way.
Yes, of course, we should have put a trigger warning at the beginning of the episode that we were going to talk about the soul and spirits and all these sort of things. But this should not come as much of a surprise, because the more we accept to broaden the definition of psychology, the more we should acknowledge things that maybe cannot be studied in a lab. I will make you an example, and this comes from animal behavior. because there isn't much a distinction between neuroscience and the study of animal behavior. It's just the brain of different creatures, right? You're studying the brain. And once there was a person asking these neuroscientists, a very famous neuroscientist, do you think that dogs have consciousness? That's a very deep question, right? If we think what consciousness is, that's a really powerful question. And she said, yes, of course, because they can recognize themselves in the mirror. Right. And so she was sure that consciousness is just that. Right. So sometimes we're using the same words, but in the contemporary psychology, we have reduced them down so much that they're not even themselves anymore. Because consciousness, I'm sure of one thing, that is not enough to recognize yourself in the mirror, to be conscious of what you're doing. We become conscious of our own mistakes, sometimes years later. Consciousness of the relationship that nature has within itself, consciousness of higher realities, these mirrors don't have a lot to do with them. So there's that problem. We're using the soul because we're looking at a wider picture, and psychology, since it started having fear of the soul or of non-quantifiable realities, it started restricting what is it studying. And now eventually it is just the therapeutical part of neuroscience. There's nothing more to it. And that's sad.
It is. Now, perhaps moving to the area of psychotherapy, were there physiotherapists in classical Islam?
Actually, yes. And I know that this is very surprising because there is this idea that Islamic civilization was very famous for medicine, for example. This is very well known. And in Islamic civilization, it was very well known that there was, for example, an attention to spiritual realities, so Sufi sheikhs or whatever, taking care of that. But there was also attention to mental health. And of course, not defined in the exact same way. But I will make some examples that would help understanding this better. And there is currently being a lot of research going on the institution of Maristan. I mean, we might talk about it later on, but it was a mental health hospital, which was all over the Muslim world. And in particular in Stanford, they're studying that and what was the inheritance of that for the Muslim world. But going back to psychotherapy in classical Islam, I think that there were at least like 3 types of figures whose work overlap with the one of a psychotherapist. And so we had the medical doctors, which in some cases, they do practice ilm al-nafs. And that is, for example, in the case of Ibn Sina, because he treated depression by talking with the patient. So like that's psychotherapy, right? Talk therapy, at least we can call it in a way. Or we had holistic or herbal doctors. They were called the hakims. Right. Oftentimes, they produce like natural cures from herbs, so not heavy pharmacology, but also they advised the client on what to do. That is basically counseling. And then we had shuyukhs of all types of disciplines, like tarbiyatul nafs, tazkiyatul nafs, suluk. And so this is where it was related to morality, to change, to personal growth. So this was more perhaps about coaching. So we have seen that all the disciplines that have to do with psychology were applied in classical Islam. And they were applied with a different outlook because, as we said before, psychology in Islam is the study and the reaching of an equilibrium between components. It is not just healing. It is not just looking, okay, you're sick there. No, it's whatever your situation is, there is always something to improve. So is your body at the top shape? Maybe. Is your heart like the inner heart, which is different than your spirit, which is different than yourself? All this part, are they at their best shape and are they in equilibrium within each other? Are they bringing you to grow instead of being stagnating? That is basically Islamic psychology in practice.
Right. So can you just talk us through perhaps Muslim psychological discoveries in history? This is not in recent times, but going back to people like Al-Kindi and Ibn Sina, you mentioned already of Farabi, Al-Ghazali even. What were their contributions to psychological discoveries?
Yes, there are many. I will list a few. And what I find most surprising of them is that their contributions are not just in the spiritual psychology we believe Islamic psychology is. This is actual general psychology. So I will make an example. Al-Balqi, so we're talking about 9th century of the current era, very early. He described neurosis and psychosis as different states of mental disorders. He described a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. Ibn Sina was perhaps the first person in history to describe schizophrenia.
Wow.
جنون المفرط. And this is very interesting because in many textbooks of psychology, they say that schizophrenia did not exist before World War I. Maybe it didn't even exist because it's such a strange sickness. It's a very interesting sickness, schizophrenia. Yet we have Ibn Sina describing something similar, or Al-Kindi talked about self-help, or Ibn Miskawayh, all his work is about how to be happy, so positive psychology, right? Or Al-Farabi talking about social psychology. And then we have Ar-Razi talking about depression. Ar-Razi was another great thinker, was also practicing doctor. So we see that doctors really had a hand of mental health as well. And then we have the more spiritual aspects are still the applied psychology. So Al-Ghazali talked about the relationship between physical health and spiritual health, how they affect each other. Or Ibn al-Qayyim talked about cognitive restructuring. That's one of the main tools that a psychologist you have to help a person think outside their frames of thinking, which might be distorted. Or Ibn al-Jawzi talked about developmental psychology and how to help people go through the stages of their life. And these are just some examples of the wealth of wisdom that we have inherited from classical Islamic knowledge and that are unfortunately completely ignored in Western psychology.
Yeah, gosh. Now, I'm sure many people would like to ask: were these key figures? Did they use the scientific method, and are these discoveries still valid today? I mean, can we relate to them as a scientific worldview? Did they use that methodology, and are they still relevant today? Because we're talking about people here going back over 1,000 years.
Yes. So thank you for this question. It's very important because Muslim thinkers did use the scientific method as one of the methods they used. So they didn't use to believe that the scientific method was epistemologically superior to other methods, and they believed that still logics was superior. And by the way, the scientific method, I just assisted my son who's doing fourth grade, studying Galileo Galilei. Of course, we say in Italy, I don't know if it's all over the West, that he invented the scientific method, right? And I was a bit taken aback because I remember quite clearly reading in the words of Ibn al-Haytham that he describes the scientific method quite clearly. So I was quite taken aback by that. But I don't know if it's just an Italian thing. We always like to promote our own scientists and artists.
No, well, we have the same thing with Newton and other people who the first to invent, discover the circulation of the blood, for example. An English guy did that. Well, actually, an Arab had discovered it 500 years before. But hey, who cares about that? But no, it's the covering up basically of this much more historic and distant past, which is deemed irrelevant to the West. But this is part of the kind of supremacist, Eurocentric attitude, really, which really has to go if we're to have an objective understanding of our past and our history and our present too, I think.
Yes, and continuing on the scientific method, I would like to add a couple of things on that. That the first thing is that, for example, if we see when Ibn Sina thought that applying the electroconvulsive therapy would help some patient, and he bought at the fish market, is it called a stingray, the one that has electricity in English, perhaps? This big fish, okay, and he applied it on the head of the patient. Yeah. So, and he observed that their symptoms got better. And of course, this is not something that happens by chance. You do not just go to the fish market, buy a live fish, put it on the head of a client without using a scientific thinking. That is scientific thinking. Of course it is. How could it not be? And there are so many examples of that because these figures also used medications and techniques. And of course, you can only use these if you had a scientific thinking and you evaluated whether it worked or not. Was it a Galilean one? I don't know. We do not have data on that, but of course it had to be logically, otherwise the results would be different. And about the scientific effects, please remember also that it's very important that as early as 2005, there has been a paper, an academic paper published by a person called Ioannidis, and the title was "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." And this came out in PLOS Medicine. So this is not a small impact factor journal. This is a big academia, right? And he said, look, we're using the scientific method. We're publishing a lot of material, but the majority of this is false. So is this an epistemologically superior way of knowing things than other modalities? I think, especially in psychology, we should be very open to think what other ways do we have to know people? We work with people, we have experiential inward senses, we have introspection. Are these ways all to be disregarded in favor of a single publication which might not even be replicable? These are big questions, I think, for psychology today.
Yeah, and also Ibn Khaldun, a very famous Muslim writer and scientist, arguably the inventor of sociology. Actually, again, usually credited to the West, but we have his work, and it's clearly he's the pioneer in this area many centuries ago.
Yes, and again, did he use an experimental design? Of course not, because in sociology and in the philosophy of history, you can't. You're being philosophical, and that is the correct method for the discipline. Yeah. And his writings are still, I think, relevant nowadays. How many times do we see, especially if we go through the Arab part of Twitter or whatever, his quotes being applied to what is happening nowadays? It's like everybody knows them. Everybody knows this quotation, and they're so actual, and they stand the test of time.
Yes, that's true. So my last question really is, what was mental care like 1,000 years ago in Muslim lands? What would it look like?
This is very interesting because it is also food for thought about the interaction between healthcare, political system, the idea of a state. These are very important questions. And in classical Islam, we had mental health care provided for free, but not by the state. It was provided by an institution which was called the Waqf, and the plural Awqaf, which were pious institution in which, like a foundation, I think it is in the West, you alienate part of your wealth and you set it in a way in which it can be maintained and generate profit on one side, and then it has a charitable outcome on the other. So, for example, there's a bakery, and the profits of that bakery go in the mental health hospital. So this was the way, and the state did not control anything of it. Right? Mental health care was administered. Of course, sometimes the caliph or some minister also participated donating in more awqaf or donating more money to an existing waqf. And this was important because this institution of mental health were really top-notch. And the main example is the Maristan, which was a hospital usually in the center of the city. Have you ever seen like a mental health institution in the center of a city? It's very particular, right? Usually you put people who are not well away, so you can't see them, right? Well, it was in the center, and the people who were inside could even see from the top, from their rooms, the people walking down and doing their daily business. And this is, for people who are not well mentally, is very helpful to see life. Many things were made to make their life better. Of course, there was therapy, psychotherapy and medical therapy, but much more than that. It was chosen in the areas which had the cleanest air, recognizing already the importance of pollution in mental health. Right. And the doctors had to make the client or the patient believe that he was going to get better. So optimism was used as a therapy. Mm-hmm. Also, hydrotherapy was used. We know the importance of the hammam or Turkish bathrooms, right? So there's alternance of hot and cold and the sound of water. These are all therapeutic things that we can include for mental health care. And even once a person finished their stay at the hospital, they were given a bit of money when they go back home. Why? Because mental health is very affected by economical stressors. And these are things that we're discovering today. So the type of mental health that was there in classical Islam was excellent. But at the same time, it was not given by a state. And I think this is really, really thought-provoking.
Yeah. No, it's a really important point there. With didn't have nation states like we do today, where all of our life tends to be increasingly controlled, managed by government agencies, by the state, and with a concomitant loss of freedom and autonomy and independence from the state. And of course, all meant very well. We're doing this for the public good, but it is the encroachment of the state into family life, into the management of children and their education, all areas of life. But in the Muslim world, as you mentioned, these waqf, these independent, non-governmental institutions where people were cared for and money was provided, and it didn't come from taxation or from the caliph even, usually. So it's a very interesting model, and a very civilized, arguably a very civilized way of doing it as well, and a model for us today if we want to move away from this quite rigid, arguably authoritarian nation state model, which we've exported, we meaning Europeans have exported through colonization into the rest of the world. We see this in the Arab world, where everyone's cut up into these little statelets with their own flags and national anthems, their own individual armies. And this is not how it used to be in the Muslim world at all. But that's a completely different subject, of course. May I recommend, slightly tangentially, this book, Lost Islamic History by Feras Al-Khatib, Reclaiming Muslim Civilization from the Past. And this is broadly compatible, I think, with what you're saying. It talks about Islamic science and medicine, astronomy, and mathematics, and it goes on and on and on, and how Muslim scholars and doctors pioneered in this area, many areas, long before the West ever got around to doing this, and how the West inherited a lot of this. You mentioned Ibn Sina briefly, a medical man, amongst many other things, and how his influence on the West was absolutely key in the 16th and 17th centuries, up to the 16th and 17th centuries. So I recommend that book, Lost Islamic History, Reclaiming Muslim Civilization from the Past. You can get it online very easily. But before we conclude this particular part, do you have any final words, Dr. Francesca?
If I may also recommend books.
Please. Oh, absolutely. That's what we do. More books
People
are better.
really love the history of Islamic psychology. And so there is still nothing, unfortunately, in English, but there is an amazing 3-volume encyclopedia. So I have it here. It is Ilm al-Nafs fi al-Turath al-Islami, and that's where I've took most of the info for today, because it covers author by author, like Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, 50 pages on Ibn Sina, and so on. And this was curated by Dr. Uthman Najati, which has been one of the co-founder of modern Islamic psychology from Egypt, very important person. And if you want to know more about the recent history of Islamic psychology, we have this book, which is Islamic psychology.
Just slightly higher.
Okay, Islamic psychology around the globe.
Perfect.
Okay, I can put this in the description, and it tells you country by country what happened and what is going on about Islamic psychology nowadays, India, Pakistan, even the UK. So I think it's going to be very interesting for most of the viewers.
Very interesting. Gosh, well, thank you very much indeed. Well, this is fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Francesca. This is part 1 of a 3-part series of videos, and we will leave it there until the next video, inshallah. So, assalamu alaikum.
Salam.